That morning began like hundreds of others in the Wyoming Valley. The miners woke up on time, drank their coffee, skimmed the newspaper, and stepped out of their homes believing this was just another ordinary workday. There were no alarms, no emergency warnings, only one small detail no one seemed to notice. The river above the mine was higher than usual, and it was still rising. No one talked about it, because in this place, rising water was familiar, and familiarity rarely feels dangerous. But history rarely kills people in a single day. History kills through habit. What turned a region that once powered American industry into a place that buried the very people who built it? And why did this disaster not only take lives, but force an entire industry to change forever? If you want to understand why the worst catastrophes often begin with the most ordinary moments, stay with us until the end of this video. And if stories like this matter to you, don't forget to like and subscribe, because these are not just stories to watch, but stories to remember. Wyoming Valley, when energy became power. By the late 19th century, Wyoming Valley was neither remote nor poor. It was one of the most important energy centers of an industrializing America. Beneath its hills and quiet towns lay vast reserves of anthracite coal, a fuel that burned hotter, longer, and cleaner than ordinary coal, and was considered premium energy at the time. In New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, millions of homes were heated by coal pulled from this valley. Factories ran, railroads crossed state lines, and entire cities along the East Coast depended directly on energy extracted from Wyoming Valley. For decades, coal was not just fuel. It was the foundation of national growth. Around the mines, communities took shape. Housing, stores, schools, churches, and hospitals all existed because of the mines and survived through them. Most able-bodied men in the region worked underground. They understood the mines, they were used to them, and they believed the mines would always be there, just as they had been for their entire lives. The coal companies were more than employers. They sat at the center of economic and social life. Wages, benefits, and even the daily rhythm of the towns followed the mine schedules. Over time, economic power became social power, where decisions made in company offices directly shaped the fate of entire communities. In a system like this, stability became an assumption. The mines had operated for decades. Millions of tons of coal had been extracted. Accidents happened, but rarely, and were often accepted as an unavoidable part of the job. The prevailing belief was that all risks were known, controlled, and already accounted for. When an industry becomes a national lifeline, it does not only produce energy, it produces silence. And the question that follows is this: what happens when that lifeline begins to weaken, when profits decline, and when decisions once considered safe are forced to be reconsidered under pressure to survive? Post-war decline and the pressure to dig deeper. After World War II, life in the Wyoming Valley began to change, though not in ways that were immediately visible. Work shifts still started on time. The mines remained open, but the world beyond the valley had entered a different era. Oil and natural gas surged across the American energy market. They were cheaper, more flexible, and did not require thousands of men working underground. Anthracite coal, once a premium fuel, slowly became obsolete. Extraction costs continued to rise, while market prices failed to keep pace. For the mining companies, the calculation became simple and unforgiving: either extract more coal or shut down. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, mines across the Wyoming Valley closed one by one. Towns that had once thrived began to see shops shuttered, families leave, and job boards sit empty. Unemployment rose quickly. For many families, losing a mining job meant losing income, health coverage, and their place within the community. In a region where nearly every livelihood depended on coal, alternative options were scarce. The mines that remained entered a different phase. To sustain output, they were forced to dig deeper into the earth. They pushed closer to areas once considered risky, and they worked seams that were harder to reach, more expensive to extract, and more dangerous. On paper, safety procedures still existed. In practice, they were increasingly viewed as slow and obstructive. Each additional layer of roof support meant added cost. Each inspection meant lost time. As profits shrank, safety began to be treated as a burden to be minimized. The workers understood the risks were growing. They had spent their lives underground. They recognized the signs when conditions changed, when spaces narrowed, when the rock overhead felt closer than it should, but they also understood that refusing to work did not mean safety. It meant unemployment. In that environment, decisions were made not out of recklessness, but necessity. Continuing to dig was the only way for the mine to survive. And for the mine to survive, old limits began to shift. When losing a job means losing everything, safety becomes negotiable. And the question now was no longer whether risk existed, but which path the Knox mine chose to follow in order to keep operating within a system that was rapidly closing off all alternatives. Knox mine, warnings that were already known. By the late 1950s, as many mines across the valley had already shut down, the Knox mine continued operating. Located in the town of Pittston, the mine sat in a position that any experienced engineer would recognize as sensitive. Part of Knox's tunnel system ran directly beneath the Susquehanna River, the largest river in the region, carrying an immense volume of water year-round. Mining beneath a river was not new. It had been done before, but only under strict conditions. When excavating near a riverbed, the rock ceiling above had to be regularly probed to determine how much thickness remained. A minimum distance was considered the safety boundary, the point at which the water above was still separated from the mine by a solid layer of rock. On paper, these rules still existed. Engineers and supervisors were trained to understand the danger of mining too close to the river. They knew that even a small miscalculation in roof thickness could allow the water pressure above to overwhelm the entire tunnel system below. Records and later testimony show that these dangers were not theoretical. Concerns had already been raised that the river slope section was advancing too close to the riverbed. Measurements indicated that the safety margin was shrinking, and this was not information hidden from management. The river slope was also the most coal-rich section of the Knox mine. At a time when other mines had closed, this area determined whether Knox could continue operating at all. Every additional meter excavated meant more output, and every pause to reassess risk meant falling behind in a race Knox could not afford to lose. The decisions made at Knox mine were not the result of a single individual. They emerged from a system accustomed to balancing risk against production. Safety procedures were not eliminated, but they were interpreted more flexibly. Roof probing no longer occurred at every location as it once had. Limits that had once been considered absolute began to be treated as negotiable. Everyone involved understood that the risk was increasing. They understood the mine's position, they understood the weight of the river above them, and they understood that if the roof failed, the consequences would be uncontrollable. But in a system where choices were narrowing by the day, continuing to dig still appeared reasonable at the time. Sometimes disasters do not happen because no one knew, but because everyone knew and no one dared to stop. And the question now is this: what moment transformed those accepted risks into a disaster that could no longer be reversed? January 22, 1959, the final morning. The morning of January 22, 1959 began exactly like the mornings before it in the Wyoming Valley. There were no unusual signs on the surface, no emergency alerts. Just another ordinary winter workday. Frank Orlowski woke up as he always did. He made his coffee, opened the newspaper, and sat down, following a routine shaped by years underground. Frank rarely ate breakfast, but that morning he felt hungry. His wife prepared a bowl of cereal and packed a few extra sandwiches for his lunch pail. No one considered it worth noting. On another bus route, Samuel Altieri rode to work alongside his wife. They sat together as usual, sharing a familiar stretch of road before each stepped off at their respective stops. A brief goodbye. A routine promise to see each other later. There was no reason to think this would be the last time. Below ground, Joseph Stella entered the Knox mine to carry out a routine inspection. He was familiar with the maze of tunnels that stretched beneath Pittston. Work shifts in the river slope section were already underway. Machines ran. Excavation continued, following plans that had been approved and repeated many times before. In this section, roof probing was no longer carried out as consistently as it once had been. Safety margins had narrowed over successive shifts. Measurements that had once defined strict limits were now treated as reference points. No one viewed this as recklessness. It was simply how the mine now operated under existing conditions. Above them, the Susquehanna River was running high. Heavy rains earlier in the week had increased the volume and weight of the water. That pressure bore down on the rock below, though none of it was visible in the miners' working environment. The collapse of the rock ceiling did not come with a loud explosion. There was no warning. Only the sudden failure of the final barrier. Water from the Susquehanna River surged into the mine in an instant. The tunnel system began to fill. At the surface, the river started to churn violently at a single point, as though the ground beneath it had vanished. A powerful whirlpool formed, pulling down mud, debris, and chunks of ice carried by the floodwaters. The river began to consume the mine beneath it. There was no explosion, no warning, only the sound of water. The escape in the dark. The water rose quickly, not in waves, not in stages, just a steady increase, minute by minute, filling tunnels that had been designed for air, not floodwater. Miners began leaving their work positions. There was no centralized order, no evacuation plan for a situation like this. Each man chose a direction based on personal experience, memory of the tunnel layout, and how much time he believed he still had. Darkness followed as the water reached the electrical systems. The sound inside the mine changed. Machinery fell silent. What remained was the sound of water striking rock and hurried footsteps echoing through narrow passages. Some groups found ventilation shafts farther upstream. They climbed in freezing conditions, gripping wet metal, and waited. Some were forced to remain submerged in cold water for hours, keeping only their heads and chests above the surface, uncertain whether the water would continue rising or finally stop. Others had no such option. Familiar routes disappeared as water surged through them. Lower tunnels filled first. Distances between groups were cut off quickly, not by collapse, but by time. As survivors began reaching the surface, they gathered outside the Knox mine, clothes soaked, exhausted, some injured. No one knew exactly how many remained below. Families began to arrive, wives, children, relatives. They waited without lists, without official announcements, without timelines. Information spread through whispers, through the expressions of those who had escaped, and through the absence of those who had not. The number 12 began to surface, not as confirmation, but as a void. Those who did not return, those no one saw emerge from the tunnels. In disasters, silence can be more terrifying than screams. And the question now is no longer who made it out, but whether there is any chance left for those who did not. Rescue. When it was already too late. On the surface, the response was immediate. Not because there was time, but because standing still was not an option. The breach beneath the river had to be sealed, or the entire mine system would continue to drown. Along the banks of the Susquehanna River, efforts began in the only way still available. Rail cars were pushed into the whirlpool, bales of hay, timber, large rocks. Anything that could be gathered was thrown into the collapsing point in the hope of slowing the flow. The river did not stop. It swallowed everything dropped into it, crushing the debris and pulling it out of sight. Even the heaviest objects made no visible difference during the first hours. As the scale of the disaster exceeded local capacity, outside forces were called in. The Army, the Navy, engineers and technical advisors were brought in to assess the situation. Measurements were taken at connected mines throughout the region. The results confirmed what no one wanted to hear. Water levels at nearby shafts had risen hundreds of feet. That meant the Knox mine was nearly completely flooded. Any remaining air pockets, if they existed at all, were shrinking by the hour. Pumps were set into continuous operation. Day and night lost distinction. Water was removed, but the level dropped only marginally, nowhere near enough to change the outcome. The volume of river water that had poured into the mine far exceeded the capacity of the pumping systems on site. Outside the mine, time moved differently. Each passing hour reduced the possibility of rescue. There were no official statements confirming survivors underground. Language grew more cautious. Statements shifted. Hope began to be spoken of in the past tense. Gradually, an unavoidable truth took shape. Not because of a lack of effort, not because of delay, but because the system had crossed the point of recovery from the very first moment. The rescue continued, but no longer with the goal of saving lives, only to confirm what had already happened. Investigation and the cost of the system. When the water finally stopped rising, the story did not end. It entered a different phase, one in which the decisions made earlier could no longer remain unnamed. Investigations began with the same central question. Why did the mine roof fail at that exact location? And why did the safety systems not prevent what followed? Technical records showed that mining at the Knox mine had advanced too close to the bed of the Susquehanna River. Minimum clearance distances once considered safety boundaries had been reduced. Roof probing, a mandatory procedure when mining beneath a river, had not been consistently carried out in the river slope section. This was not a single oversight, but a pattern of repeated violations over time. Those findings led directly to company leadership. The decisions that shaped the mine's operation did not originate underground, but at management levels responsible for production targets and schedules. They understood the mine's location. They understood the pressure of the river above, and they understood the risks involved in continuing to dig. The outcome was a rare precedent in American mining history. Several company executives were criminally indicted for safety violations resulting in loss of life. The case went beyond civil liability or financial compensation. It forced a direct confrontation with the question of who bears responsibility when a system is allowed to operate dangerously for years. While legal proceedings moved forward, those most affected remained on the margins. Widows and families of the missing miners waited in silence. Information arrived slowly. Financial support did not come immediately. Some families waited years before receiving official death benefits. For the Wyoming Valley community, the damage extended beyond the courtroom. Trust in the industry that had sustained them was shattered. The mines were no longer seen as stable pillars, but as risks concealed for too long. Towns that had once revolved around coal began to change in ways that could not be undone. Wyoming Valley was no longer the same, not only because of those who were lost, but because the system once trusted had collapsed in full view of everyone. The Angola Horror, 1867. When history repeated itself in another industry. This was not the first time the United States paid a price for a system growing faster than its ability to control it. Nearly a century before the Knox mine disaster, another catastrophe unfolded, this time not underground, but on the rails. In 1867, America was still recovering from the Civil War. Hundreds of thousands had died, but the nation was entering a period of reconstruction. The demand for travel was rising rapidly, and railroads had become the fastest and most advanced form of transportation of the era. On the morning of December 18, 1867, the Lakeshore Express departed Cleveland bound for Buffalo. Passengers boarded for many reasons: business, family visits, honeymoons. No one boarded believing they were stepping into a system still unfinished. At the time, passenger cars were largely constructed of wood. Each car contained coal-burning stoves to combat the harsh winter cold. Braking systems were primitive, and most critically, railroad track gauges were not yet fully standardized across the country. Under these conditions, everything still appeared normal. Trains ran daily. Large-scale accidents were rare. The risks existed, but they were accepted as part of progress. As the train passed through Angola, New York, a small irregularity in the track was enough to push the system past the point of no return. The final car derailed. 2 passenger cars were thrown from the bridge and plunged into the deep gorge below. The impact was not the end. Wood splintered, stoves broke free from their mounts. Hot coals and fire spread rapidly through the cars. Passengers who survived the fall found themselves trapped inside a structure engulfed in flames. Within minutes, the scene became an inferno that rescuers could not approach. Many victims died not from the crash itself, but from the fire. When recovery efforts finally began, identifying the bodies proved extraordinarily difficult. Some victims were never identified. News of the disaster spread quickly across the nation. Newspapers named it the Angola Horror. Public outrage followed, driven not only by the death toll, but by how the railroad system had been operating up to that point. Public pressure forced the railroad industry to change. Wooden passenger cars were gradually banned. Track gauges were standardized nationwide. Braking systems were improved. Decisions once considered sufficiently safe were no longer acceptable. Ironically, a small detail from that morning altered history in another way. One passenger who intended to board that train arrived late. He was not on the Lakeshore Express when the accident occurred. His name was John D. Rockefeller. A train delayed by a few minutes saved one life and exposed the structural weaknesses of an entire industry. 2 disasters, 2 different eras, one beneath the ground, one on the rails. The Knox mine and the Angola Horror differ in form, but not in nature. Both unfolded within systems under pressure to grow. Profits had to be maintained, schedules had to be met, and familiar risks gradually became acceptable. Not because people did not know, but because the system required them to believe that everything was still under control. When those systems collapsed, people paid the price first. Not as a single tragic moment, but as the inevitable result of a series of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time they were made. After the Knox mine disaster, regulations governing mining beneath rivers became stricter. After the Angola Horror, wooden rail cars disappeared, track gauges were standardized, and braking systems were improved. These changes did not come from foresight, but from loss already endured. They remain today as traces left behind by those who were never protected in time. Every safety standard you benefit from today carries the name of someone who was not protected. And the question that remains is this: have the systems we trust today truly learned the lessons of history, or are they simply repeating them in more subtle ways? If stories like these matter to you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Thank you for watching until the end. We'll see you in the next video.